GE's real China problem is not that China has suddenly built a better jet engine. That would be the easy version of the story. It would also be the version GE could probably live with. Because if this were only a technical race, GE and Safran would still look comfortable. Their CFM LEAP engine comes with global airline trust, deep maintenance support, certification history, and years of operating data China still does not have. So on paper, this should not feel like an immediate threat. But that is exactly why the story is easy to misread. The real danger is not that China's engine beats GE's engine tomorrow. The danger is that China may be building a system where GE's engine no longer has to be chosen. And that changes the whole equation. The C919 is already flying passengers inside China, but the engine under its wing still comes from CFM International, the joint venture between GE and Safran. So China's flagship domestic jet still has a foreign pressure point sitting under the wing. That is the part Beijing wants to remove. And if China can replace it with an engine that is not world-class, but good enough for Chinese airlines, accepted by Chinese regulators, supported by Chinese maintenance crews, and protected by Chinese demand, then GE's problem becomes much bigger than one engine. Because the C919 would no longer be just a Chinese aircraft using Western power. It would become the star of a domestic aviation ecosystem where China controls the plane, the engine, the regulator, the airlines, the service network, and eventually the market itself. For years, the C919 was easy to dismiss. A prestige project, a political symbol, a jet that mattered more on posters than in airline schedules. That became harder to say once it started carrying passengers. The C919 received its Chinese type certificate in 2022. Then it entered commercial service with China Eastern in 2023. That did not prove China had solved commercial aviation, but it did change the question. Because once an aircraft enters airline service, the standard changes immediately. The question is no longer whether China can build a jet that flies. The question becomes whether China can build enough of them, support them, keep them on schedule, maintain them at scale, and turn a political project into a working part of a national airline system. And this is where GE enters the story in a much more serious way. Because the C919 may be China's answer to Boeing and Airbus on paper, but one of the most important certified systems on the aircraft still comes from outside China. The engine under the wing is the LEAP-1C from CFM International, the GE-Safran joint venture. That detail changes the meaning of the whole aircraft. It means China did not just build a domestic narrow-body jet. It built a domestic narrow-body jet with a Western propulsion backbone. And that backbone matters more than most viewers probably think. Because the engine is not just another supplier line in a parts list. It affects performance, certification, maintenance, reliability, support, and long-term airline economics. In other words, it affects the exact areas that decide whether an aircraft becomes a real commercial platform or stays a politically important one. So yes, the C919 is already flying. That is real. It matters. But it also exposes the limit of the achievement. China now has an aircraft in service that proves progress. At the same time, it also exposes dependency. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. The C919 did not remove the old aviation order. It entered it while still depending on one of its most important systems. And once you see that clearly, the logic behind the CJ1000 starts to look very different. It stops looking like a simple engine program. It starts looking like China's attempt to remove the most uncomfortable foreign dependency left inside its flagship commercial jet. This is where the story stops being simple. Because when people hear that the C919 still relies on a Western engine, the natural reaction is to picture a single imported component. A powerful one, yes, but still just one component. Swap it out later. Solve the problem. Move on. That sounds neat. It is also misleading. The LEAP-1C is not just a machine producing thrust under the wing. It is part of an integrated propulsion system that includes the engine itself, but also the nacelle, the thrust reverser, the way the engine sits on the aircraft, the way it behaves in operation, the way it is certified, and the way it is maintained once it enters airline service. That changes the scale of what China is actually trying to replace. This is not just about building a domestic engine core that runs well in a test cell. It is about replacing a whole propulsion architecture that touches performance, heat management, vibration, maintenance access, flight characteristics, support procedures, and certification logic. In other words, the dependency is deeper than the word engine suggests. And this is where the story changes. Because once you understand that, the CJ1000 stops looking like a prestige side project designed to prove China can make a turbofan. it starts looking like a sovereignty project. China is not only trying to build an engine, it is trying to remove a foreign-controlled layer from the center of its flagship commercial aircraft. That is a much more serious ambition. And it also explains why this is harder than a lot of headlines make it sound. A modern commercial engine is not valuable just because it produces thrust. It is valuable because airlines trust what comes with it. They trust the maintenance ecosystem behind it. They trust the spare parts flow. They trust the service logic. They trust the data. They trust the fact that thousands of cycles have already exposed weak points before those weak points reach their fleet. That is where GE and Safran still have a real advantage. Not just in metallurgy, not just in design, in proof, years of it. That accumulated proof is part of product. So when China talked about replacing the LEAP 1C, it is not really trying to copy a finished Western component in isolation. It is trying to rebuild the support, confidence, certification path, and operational logic that make the component commercially meaningful. That is why the C919's remaining dependency matters so much. It is not simply an embarrassment in the story of a homegrown jet. It is a clearest sign that China still does not fully control the most sensitive layer of the platform it wants to scale. And once that becomes the issue, the entire GE question changes. GE is not just defending an engine sale. It is defending its place inside the most sensitive part of the aircraft. That is why the CJ1000A matters, even before it proves itself globally. Because if China ever gets this substitution right, even imperfectly, it does not just localize one part. It weakens one of the last foreign control points sitting inside the C919 program. And that is where the real strategic threat begins. At this point, the obvious question is almost impossible to avoid. Is the CJ1000A actually better than the LEAP? Technically, that is a fair question. Strategically, it is the wrong one to ask first, because this story does not become important the moment China builds a better engine. It becomes important the moment China builds an engine that is good enough to start reducing foreign dependence inside its own system. That is a very different threshold. In a normal global aviation market, a less proven engine has a brutal road ahead of it. Airlines are not just buying thrust. They are buying dispatch reliability, maintenance predictability, fuel burn, spare parts access, lessor confidence, resale logic, regulator trust, and the confidence that comes from years of real airline service. That is why GE and Safran are hard to displace. Their advantage is not only technical, it is institutional. Their products come with an entire global support reality that new entrants do not have. But China does not necessarily have to play by that global sequence first. That is the part that makes this story much more serious than a standard engine comparison. If the CJ1000A can become safe enough for Chinese certification, reliable enough for Chinese airline operations, maintainable enough for Chinese service networks, and available without Western export permission, then the engine starts to matter strategically even if it is still weaker than the LEAP in some categories. That sounds uncomfortable because it is. It means the definition of success is not best in the world. It may be good enough inside China. And if that sounds like a lower bar, it is. But it is also a bar that can still change the market. Because once China gets a domestic engine into repeated airline use, even on a limited scale, the country starts collecting the one thing that every new commercial engine program needs, and no lab can fully simulate: operational experience, flight hours, maintenance history, failure patterns, reliability data, crew familiarity, shop floor learning. That is how weak products improve, not in headlines, in repetition. So the real strategic question is not whether the CJ1000A can embarrass GE tomorrow. It is whether China can give the engine enough protected running room to improve while the rest of the world is still focused on whether it is already the best. And if that is what is happening, then GE is not just watching a rival engine. It is watching China create room for a weaker engine to get better. That is much harder to stop than a single product launch. This is where the story gets bigger than GE, bigger than Safran, and bigger than one engine program. Because China is not trying to do this in a small market. It is trying to do it inside one of the largest aviation growth markets in the world. That matters because scale changes what a country can afford to learn through. In most places, a weaker new engine would face the market immediately. Airlines would compare it against better proven alternatives. Lessors would hesitate. Maintenance networks would be cautious. Regulators outside the home country would ask hard questions, and the product could stall before it had enough time to improve. China is in a different position. Its domestic market is large enough to give a developing platform room to operate, gather data, expose weaknesses, train crews, build maintenance routines, and improve without needing global trust on day one. That may be the real advantage here, not just state backing. Repeated use without outside pressure. And that matters more than it sounds. Because commercial aviation is a brutal business to learn in theory. Aircraft and engines do not become reliable because a company declares them ready. They become reliable through cycles. Flights, delays, maintenance errors, hot sections wearing out faster than expected, spare part shortages, software behavior, airline routines, real service. That learning process is expensive, it is slow, and most challengers never get enough operational room to finish it. China might. That is why the phrase good enough is more dangerous than it first appears. If the CJ-1000A becomes good enough for domestic Chinese operations, then it does not need to win the global argument immediately. It only needs to stay in service long enough to keep learning. And once that happens, the logic starts feeding itself. Aircraft deliveries create flight hours. Flight hours create maintenance data. Maintenance data improves reliability. Reliability improves regulator confidence. Regulator confidence supports more deliveries. That is a flywheel. And that is what GE should be watching most closely. Not one test, not one claim, not one patriotic headline. A protected domestic market, giving a weaker engine repeated chances to get better. Because if China can do that, then the threat does not arrive all at once. It builds quietly, first inside Chinese airlines, then inside Chinese maintenance networks, then inside Chinese procurement logic. And by the time the rest of the market treats it as serious, the learning curve may already be much farther along than it appears from the outside. That is when this stops being a question about whether the CJ-1000A is already world-class, and becomes a question about whether China has built the conditions that could eventually make it competitive enough. Up to this point, China's engine push could still look like long-term ambition. Then 2025 made the vulnerability visible. COMAC fell behind C919 delivery targets, and a temporary U.S. export halt involving CFM engines reportedly slowed progress. That changed the argument around the CJ-1000A. It was no longer just about pride or long-term autonomy. It became operational. If a foreign supplier can slow your aircraft program, then you do not fully control it. That is a lesson Beijing is unlikely to ignore. It also creates a dilemma for the West. Keep supplying the C919, and you help China scale a future competitor. Restrict supply, and you strengthen the case for domestic substitution. That is why the CJ-1000A now looks less like an upgrade path and more like supply chain insurance. China still cannot shortcut the engineering. The engine must survive real airline service. But politically, something has already changed. A weaker domestic engine becomes easier to accept when the alternative is strategic exposure. From GE's point of view, the threat is no longer just that China wants independence someday. It is that recent events gave China a more urgent reason to build it now. This is where the story comes into focus. GE's real China problem is not one engine or one headline. It is the possibility that China closes a loop. A Chinese airframe paired with a Chinese engine, certified at home, flown by Chinese airlines, supported by Chinese maintenance networks, backed by Chinese procurement, and reinforced by Chinese political will. Once those pieces start reinforcing each other, GE is no longer competing against another engine maker. It is competing against a domestic system that can absorb early weakness in exchange for long-term control. That is the real threat. In a normal market, a weaker engine has to win trust before it gets enough operational time to improve. China may be trying something different by using its domestic market to give the engine time, protection, and repetition. That does not guarantee success. The CJ-1000A could still face delays, reliability problems, and integration issues. But that uncertainty does not remove the threat, because the danger is not that China has already matched the leap. It is that China may be building the conditions to match it later. That is why good enough matters. If the engine becomes good enough for Chinese routes, support networks, and regulators, it can keep flying. If it keeps flying, it keeps learning. And if it keeps learning inside a protected market this large, GE and Safran are no longer facing a symbolic challenger. They are facing an industrial flywheel. And that is the part people tend to miss. The engine is not the whole threat. The closed loop is. And if that loop holds, China keeps more of the aircraft value chain at home, while Western suppliers risk losing future engine volume and aftermarket revenue. That is why GE's real China problem is not the engine. It is a possibility that China builds a market where GE's engine no longer has to win,